for having me. And I'm very sorry. I can tell I'm causing problems already with having to do this on a Zoom feed. But I apologize. I actually, when I agreed to do this, I had already something going on then that I had forgotten entirely about. And Larry was nice enough to say, sure, we can do this on Zoom. So here I am. It's not ideal, but I've been doing this for an awful long time now. So it should go just fine. And so the theme of the talk here is basically the same theme that you get probably as a joke these days when you go on family vacations. The old, the old yarn where the kids are sitting in the back whining about being on the road so long, and they want to know when are we going to get there? And it's just over this next hill or just around this next bend. Well, that's the same thing that's going on with predictions of our purportedly upcoming recession. It's been almost a year now that we've been hearing predictions about the upcoming recession that still has not arrived. We just got our real GDP stats this morning, were released by the Commerce Department, and I believe our growth rate in the fourth quarter of 2022 was it 2.7% real growth? That's a long way off from a recession, which is negative real GDP growth. So we're growing at a normal, healthy clip still, despite the fact that the upcoming recession has been predicted for months. And so we're going to use that as our basic theme here. And so this is my fourth time doing this now. So I know you've all been here before and you've satisfied the prerequisites for the class. So I will be picking up on from things that we've talked about before. Don't worry, it won't be too much of that. But and when it's necessary to explain things, I'll stop and do that. So these are the topics we're going to talk about here. And we're going to start out with this discussion of, are we going to have a recession or not? And I'm going to start out with just this graph from the Society of Professional Forecasters. This is a group that is surveyed periodically. The results of this are published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And they ask questions related to where do you think interest rates are going to be? Where do you think GDP growth is going to be, et cetera? And they ask them, what do you think the probability of a recession is over the next 12 months? Well, it's never been higher, right? Since they started the survey in 1968, right? There's a consensus almost. It's like not that strong, but the professional forecasters have never predicted a recession with such a likely probability as we're getting it now. And so this is the main theme that we've been hearing really for about 3 months now. I'm going to pull up real quick a copy of yesterday's Financial Times. This is Rob Armstrong's column. It's called Unhedged. I read it every single day. And here's the list that the theme of his column quite often now is the differing opinions about whether we're entering a slowdown or not. And that there's a constant sort of tug of war going on in the media between economists and other commentators about whether the economy is strong enough to avoid a recession, whether we're going to have a hard landing, whether we're going to have a soft landing, all of this type of stuff. And so he's going over that discussion again. There are some people that think the economy's fine. Here's all the evidence that we keep hearing about indicating that things are slowing down much more dramatically than we thought. So these are the purchasing manager surveys. They're all the quote unquote soft data. When they survey supply managers at companies, they're all saying we're going into a slowdown. That's what they call the soft data, because so far it's not being reflected in the hard data, which is the true economic data that we get released from the Labor Department and the Commerce Department. So, but the soft data, the people that are at the forefront of all of this and are looking ahead for in their industries are saying, yeah, we're approaching a slowdown. And so you can see the ISM Services New Orders Index fell, the Empire State Manufacturing Survey, New York manufacturers fell. Conference Board Leading Indicator Index. The Conference Board is the organization that publishes the consumer sentiment and the business manager sentiment surveys. They're showing negative tendencies right now. Retail sales, that's a hard number. That fell by 1.1% in December. The yield curve is inverted. We're going to talk about that. That's something we've talked about before. And it goes on from there. That's the et cetera, ad nauseum. So there's a lot of evidence that we're slowing down, but it hasn't really manifested itself in a lot of the hard data that we're seeing. as evidenced by the GDP report this morning showing the economy is still growing at a healthy pace. Okay, I wanted to share one thing with you that's related to this, but not directly. And this is a chart from uh, Matthew Klein's newsletter called Overshoot. And he is making the case here that the United States economy, because of the policy interventions that we had, which were much more aggressive in the United States than anywhere else in the world, we've done fairly well. The blue line is showing you how much of a downturn that we had as a result of the pandemic. And as you can see from that, our downturn was pretty much right around the average, right? Some countries had a less of a slowdown, some had much more of a slowdown. We're kind of right in the middle. But you can see the red part now is subsequent growth, 2021 Q4. Okay, and so you can see that we were already starting to grow, right? And these other economies, all of them essentially developed economies, right? We're still in negative territory. So we've done better. Our policy response was much stronger than these other countries, and it obviously had an impact on our economic performance. And so, as bad as things may look here, they're worse in other parts of the world where they haven't fully recovered from the pandemic yet. This is telling us that as of 2021 Q4, we were back and recovered essentially from where we were before the pandemic. Okay, and so the next part of the discussion, everybody's focused on labor markets here. That seems to be, that's what the Fed is watching when they're setting monetary policy. A lot of the commentary we're hearing about the effects of the pandemic recovery, and the equilibration of markets to a more normal pattern is about the labor market, because it's one of them that seems to be sort of defying a return to normalcy in many ways. In one of the ways it's not, if you just look at the standard unemployment rate, and those of you that have been here 3 years before this know that there's more to this than just what we think there is, and looking at the headline unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is as low now as it's ever been. Okay, that's been a feature of our economy in recent years, at other times as well. It's not just a matter of the strong economy, though. Remember, right? I'm going to show you a data later that we've seen before as well, showing the decline in labor force participation. If labor force participation falls, it means fewer people are looking for work. Okay, and that makes the unemployment rate go down on its own. All right, so yes, we've recovered from the pandemic quite strongly, more so than other countries. That has generated jobs that had disappeared during the pandemic. That's all part of this, of course. But at the same time, labor force participation has fallen. And if labor force participation was at the level it was before the pandemic, the unemployment rate would be much higher than it is today. Okay, other good news though, we keep getting the data on unemployment claims. You can see here, this is the pandemic recession right here. Okay, the gray bars are recessions, and you can see that initial unemployment claims spiked massively to levels we've never seen before. And as we've discussed before in these sessions, this doesn't even count everything, because they introduced a whole new unemployment assistance plan called the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program that gave assistance to people that wouldn't normally be eligible for unemployment benefits, like contractors and other workers that they're not typical hourly or salaried workers on a full-time appointment, and they're typically not eligible for unemployment benefits then. So this is not even the total. The problem is you can't get good data on those other programs because they were administered by the state and the data is terrible. So, but you can see we got 206 latest released last week, 206,000 claims for initial claims for unemployment. That's not a bad number. It's not great, but historically it's not a bad number at all. It does not indicate a recession at all. Okay, here's what I was talking about: labor force participation. Labor force participation is the fraction of the adult labor force, the adult population, that participates in the labor force. That is, they're either employed or they're unemployed, which means they have to have been actively seeking work in the last 4 weeks. Okay, that has fallen dramatically for demographic reasons over the last few years, but it also has fallen for other reasons that are not demographic, right? That are more economic in nature or behaviorally related, we should say. after the Great Recession, 2008 to 2010, right? You can see it fell dramatically during that period. It never really recovered to where we were before that recession started. Then it fell dramatically again during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And once again, it has not even recovered to where we were before the pandemic started. Okay, so people have dropped out of the labor force. They stopped even looking for work that would have been looking typically in the past. And that is not a good thing to have happening to your economy at all, right? It's happening in other developed economies as well, but it's been a particularly acute drop in the United States over the last several years. And now again, because of the pandemic. Now, there is some evidence that this is all happening just for one age group. Because if you look at labor force participation for prime age workers, 25 to 54 years old, okay, it hasn't exhibited the same pattern. Okay, we're almost as high here as we were at the peak of this around 2000 or just before 2000. Okay, and so what's going on when you look at this graph versus that graph is it tells you that it's young people and older people that are the ones that are no longer participating in the labor force. And in particular, it's the older people. It's early retirement. We have a lot of early retirements, right? A lot of people who are in the 55 plus age group, when the pandemic hits, they just say, oh, the heck with it. I'm not gonna go back and look for a job, right? My job's gone. I gotta go back now. Wages in the United States have not been great. And that hasn't been very much of an incentive for people to go back to work after they've lost a job. Okay, and so we do have an issue. It's mostly in the older age group of the population. Okay, but obviously they were an important part of the labor force before, and we don't just drop them off, right, and say that okay, we don't want them to come back. We don't really care about them. This is an important segment of the population. Okay, so we'll have to wait and see what happens with all of this. There are other things going on with labor force participation that we'll talk about as we go. But I did one of these talks not that long ago for another corporate group that had a specific request, and because they were, in an industry like with many industries in the United States, they were experiencing labor shortages. Can't get qualified workers, right? And so they wanted to know. One of the things they explicitly wanted me to discuss was where are we going to get workers? And I was stumped. I was like, I don't. So I can't answer that question necessarily, but I can show you the data and show you what's gone on and why things are so out of whack, or the extent to which they're so out of whack. This is data just going back to January 2020, okay, and through December 2022, which is the most recent data. And this is from two different labor market surveys that we conduct in the United States. We do a household survey every month, and we do an establishment survey every month. Okay, the establishment survey, when they survey firms, they're telling us that we have about 10.5 million open jobs in the country, job openings. That's way higher. You can look back, you can kind of see a more normal scenario if you look back before the pandemic recession, where I'm kind of wagging my cursor right now. Job openings are always typically higher, but not this much higher than the other two variables shown in the graph. Okay, so you got 10.5 million openings. Where are you going to get those people? Where there's 5.5 million people who are actively seeking work. Right? They're looking for a job. If they're counted as unemployed, they have to be actively seeking work in order to count. So they're out there. And then there's another group that when they survey households, they ask them, are you in the labor force or not? If they say no, I don't have a job and I haven't actively been seeking one, right? But they may say, I do want a job. It's just that I haven't been able to find one. And I've kind of given up, or I'm doing something else at home instead, or I'm a caregiver for a sick relative, or I'm taking care of the kids because we don't have the money to pay for daycare, but I do want a job. Okay, those people are obviously out there and may be attracted to employment, perhaps if wages are high enough, etc. So you can see that there are people out there. What we've got is what we call a mismatch problem in economics. There are people out there looking for jobs. There are people out there that want to hire people. Okay, but there may be a mismatch in skills or other aspects of the job that prevent them from actually matching up, okay, and creating an employment opportunity for people. But we don't know all the reasons for why this is happening. It seems to be that something has changed in labor markets. It's making people more reluctant to take a job. Okay, and a lot of that, as we've talked about in previous sessions, is probably related to the pay that's being offered, which at least has been going up now, and that may be encouraging more people to take jobs. Also, here's another look at similar data. Okay, it's just showing you that things have changed, right? So hires are people getting hired into new jobs. Separations are explained down here in this footnote. Okay, a worker quits, is fired, or is laid off. That's a separation. Okay, and hires and separations are typically right. This is a typical pattern. Hires are usually slightly above separations, right? But job openings we've seen, we've still got the number up there. There's a lot of them. So we're gonna, the point of this is to show that I've titled the graph disequilibrium. This is an anomaly. We've never seen anything like this before. Okay, if it's a new normal, then obviously we got some figuring out to do about how we're going to get some of these jobs filled. But it looks like that we're just still in the disequilibrium situation, that the economy is going to normalize. Job openings are starting to come down finally. Okay, and maybe at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be back into a situation that's more normal again. But this is, like I said, something of a mystery. Okay, we don't know all the reasons why these things are occurring, why people are not taking jobs when they're available, right? We don't ask every possible question that we could get an answer from somebody about what their motivations about for doing that sort of thing are. But when it comes to where am I going to find my workers, right? We had a particular problem with foreign-born workers during the Trump. I mean, this is well known, right? That Trump tried to restrict immigration. He did restrict immigration. You can see, right, in the last, say, 3 years of his administration right here, it was flat, right? The foreign-born labor force did not grow at all after steady growth over all these years. Then, of course, during the pandemic, we shut down the border, okay? And so no more foreign-born labor was allowed in, and so it drops, right? And then it's gone on a trajectory now where it's kind of catching up, obviously, because it's growing much more rapidly now. This is, helping fill the needs of those employers that are looking for more workers. The foreign-born labor force is an important source of this. This is something that gives us a leg up in the global economy because we're not as averse to immigration typically, except during this administration, as other countries are. So if you look at Britain, you look at other countries in Europe, they're suffering mightily from labor sources. In Britain, they kicked out their foreign labor force, and now they don't know what to do. Okay, and there's the last thing they're going to do is open up immigration to allow more foreign labor. It's so unpopular. We don't have nearly as big of a problem with that, and it makes our economy and our labor markets run more smoothly then. Okay, one of the problems, obviously, in the United States market for years, as we've discussed before, is the lack of growth in wages. Real wages, inflation-adjusted wages, before the pandemic had not really increased by much since going back to 1968. There was a graph I showed you in previous talks. Okay, that's, after decades of progress, wages just stagnated. And so the living standards of typical workers, right, were not increasing at all. And that's not the way it's supposed to work in a developed economy like ours, right? And so wage inflation is higher now than it's been. This goes back to 2007 and shows you that wage inflation, okay, these are average hourly earnings of all employees, okay, was hovering at around 2 to 3% typically. These are compositional effects. And in the pandemic, the people whose wages were less likely to go up at all were the ones that were laid off first, right? And so it looks like wage growth shot up because it's the type of people that were getting more wage increases were the ones that still had jobs. And then everybody got hired back again, and so it shoots back down again. Okay, and now we're back at sort of the compositional effects have been ironed out now, and wages are growing more rapidly, which is exactly what you would think would happen in a situation where demand exceeds supply by so much. Labor demand is very high, lots of job openings. Labor supply is not sufficient to meet that demand. whenever you have an excess of demand over supply, prices should go up. And that's what we're seeing happen. That's helping to alleviate some of the labor shortages, but this is still below the inflation rate. So real wages have not increased. Purchasing power of your wage has gone down, even though your paycheck has gone up. Okay, so again, not much of an incentive to take a job if one is available. Okay, and so we're not going to answer too many questions with that. These are the anomalies that we're trying to work out. They're things that have disrupted our labor market and to a certain extent our economy in ways that we don't necessarily fully understand. And we don't know exactly where this is all headed yet, whether we are going to normalize and return to a situation that looks like it did before the pandemic or not, or even going back further than that. We never really returned to normalcy after the Great Recession either. Okay, and so one of the other things that we've talked about before, and so I'm going to bring it up here again, is trends in interest rates. And the first graph I'm going to show you is one that I have shown you probably every time I've spoken here. And it's a very interesting graph, and you don't see too many graphs like this in economics. It's interest rates. This is the 10-year Treasury yield, which is a benchmark interest rate that we use as the basis for other interest rates in the economy. So it's followed very closely. Right, and this is going back to 1962, and it shows the general increase in the 10-year yield, as well as other interest rates were doing the same thing, peaking in the early 1980s, right, with during the period of the Volcker Fed. It's just another story that we don't need to tell right now. And then ever since then, it's been on a downward trajectory, okay, up until the pandemic. And once it got down to levels, like it did past 2010, to levels that are lower than anything we've seen in modern history, right? Then we started, wondering, when is this going to go back? Are things going to normalize? Are we going to get are we going to get interest rates that are going to be higher like we're used to seeing? And so every time it started to go up, right, everybody said, okay, this is it. It's going back up. We had an upward trend for decades. We've had a downward trend for decades. Now we're going to start a new upward trend. And every single time it would roll over and come back down, come back down, come back down. This time, the increase, oh God, I keep doing that. This time the increase has been fairly sustained, notwithstanding what's happened in just the last couple of months. 10-year yield has come down quite a bit, actually. I think we were up to about 4.2% at one point. We were back to 3.5 now. So it's coming back down again. But it looks like maybe it's not going to come down too far this time. I should be hesitant in how I say that, because every time somebody says that, they turn out to be wrong. So it does look like we might be getting some liftoff with the 10-year yield. But this is what I was talking about. Okay, it's gone up, right, to a level higher than we've seen it since before the financial crisis hit, 2008, 2009. Okay, but now it's started to decline again. Okay, is it going to continue that decline or not? Don't really know, right? But there's more to be said on this, because as we've talked about before, the yield curve is something of a forecaster of future recessions. This is the yield curve as of a few days, 2 days ago. Okay, the top line, this teal colored line, is the Treasury yield curve for 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month, all the way out to 30 years. Okay, and this yield curve would be classified as inverted. Over here, we have the real yield curve. You can generate a real interest rate yield curve based on the yields on TIPS. Treasury inflation protected securities pay you a real return. Okay, so essentially, it's compensation for inflation. Real yields, TIPS yields, have been negative for an awful long time during this whole pandemic episode, and even before that. They're now positive again. Okay, so that's really the only reason why I put the real yield on here. It doesn't extend as far. We only get it for 3, 5, 7, 10, and 20 years. Okay, but the normal Treasury yield curve, okay, is inverted, which is telling us that 30-year bonds, for example, have a lower yield than 1 month T-bills do. I mean, that's not normal. That doesn't make any sense. Holding a 30-year bond, okay, has interest rate risk or duration risk associated with it that you should have to be compensated for with a higher yield. And typically that's what happens. But in certain circumstances, historically, the yield curve is inverted. Other forces come into play. Okay, and that's what we're looking at right now. And historically, as we've talked about before, this has been a harbinger of a recession. So we can draw this graph two ways. What this graph shows is a summary of the slope of the yield curve. Okay, we can't, I mean, the slope of the yield curve is obviously different at different points. Okay, but if we want to summarize it, we can just take the 10-year yield and subtract off the 3-month yield from that. And that gives us a summary measure of the slope. That's going to be negative right now, quite obviously, because the 10-year yield is lower than the 3-month yield. It's also common to do it 10-year minus 2-year. Okay, both of those are used quite frequently. And the reason why we use them is because they generate this picture. Okay, when the yield curve inverts, when 2-year yields or 30-day yields in this case go higher than 10-year yields, it predicts an upcoming recession. And this one only shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually 8 recessions back in time. I just can't get the data going back that far. Okay, it's 8 recessions back in time that this has actually worked. It's a predictor of future recessions. So the weird one here is obviously before the pandemic, right? Because clearly the yield curve didn't predict the pandemic, which is what basically caused the recession. But if you think back to that period, we were slowing down as an economy anyway. There were lots of people saying that we were headed for a recession. There was a lot of predictions of that. And so it looked like maybe we were headed for a recession anyway. And then the pandemic hit, giving us that, delivering the recession. We've never had this spread be so negative, right? I mean, it's now more negative than it's ever been before any of these other recessions. Okay, this one it did dip below before the recession started in the first one on the graph. We just can't see it. So this is not good, right? It doesn't mean it has to happen again. This is economics. We have patterns that repeat for generations, and then all of a sudden they stop repeating. So it might be that this, we're not going to have a recession, but obviously it doesn't look good, right? Having this type of a thing, and it's something that a lot of people bank on, right? They say, well, it's predicted it before. Clearly, we're going to have a recession again. And this is one of the things that Rob Armstrong had mentioned in the FT column that I just showed for you. Okay, so evidence that we're slowing down, here it is. Evidence that we're not came out of the GDP report that just came out this morning. Okay, what is going to save us if we're not going to get a recession? Well, we keep hearing about the resiliency of the American consumer, right? The consumer is resilient. I think this was a direct quote from, one of the CEOs of one of the banks that just reported earnings. I can't remember which one now, but he said the consumer is resilient. That's going to save us. We're not worried. Okay, so, mixed signals again. Some things, lots of stuff pointing to recessions, other things aren't. Okay, but except for all the noise because of the pandemic, this is kind of an interesting graph. Okay, because what it's showing is the purple line is showing us the personal savings rate, the fraction of our disposable income that we're saving, right? And it's fallen off a cliff. Okay, we are no longer saving. We went on a spending spree right after the pandemic, right? And it seems to have continued. Okay, and so now we're saving. This is obviously not good for the future prospects of consumers, right? If they're not saving as much today, that makes the future more uncertain, and they may have more financial difficulty in the future as a result. The brown line is total consumer credit. Okay, they've got it owned or securitized, and it's as a fraction. I've created this variable as a fraction of disposable personal income. Okay, so you don't just want to put raw debt out there. How much debt is there as a fraction of what our income is? That tells you something about the debt burden facing a household, okay, or households in general in this case. So total consumer credit owned or securitized is the banks have given credit. Think of it that way. It doesn't have to be a bank, but a financial institution has given credit to a consumer. They've either kept it on their own books or they've sold it off to a securitizer. Either way, it's still money that's owed by a consumer. That's just how they add it up. So you can see it's spiking. Okay, so at the same time we're saving less, we're also, and this is part of the saving less, we're also borrowing more. Okay, so yeah, the consumer's been resilient. They've been spending at a greater clip than we thought they would. But it looks like maybe they're not going to have the resources to continue that. And we also already saw the retail sales number fell by 1.1% in December. So, there's a lot of skepticism out there about how resilient the consumer actually is in this economy. But this is how we got here. I've shown you this graph before, not up to date like it is now. Okay, this is the real disposable personal income that was in the denominator of this calculation for the brown line. Okay, this is the income that there's only two things you can do with your disposable income. Disposable income is your actual income minus taxes. Okay, and so there's only two things you can do that. You can spend it or you can save it. Right, so this is what we have available to spend and to save. And as you can see, right, it has taken a big hit in recent times. Okay, we are not earning at the level that we used to. Okay, these are the spikes due to the different pandemic policies. Our pandemic response, as I've said before, was very aggressive, which explains partially why we've had almost exclusively between monetary policy and fiscal policy, we had the shortest recession in American history. It was only 2 months. Formally, the definition of a recession, I shouldn't say for it, informally, the definition of a recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative real GDP growth. Well, we didn't get anywhere near that, but we still had a massive downturn. So the people who decide on the recessions, there's an NBER committee that does this, National Bureau of Economic Research, right? They looked at other stuff and they said, yeah, we had a severe downturn for 2 months, then it was over. Okay, why was it over? Because the policy response was so aggressive. Okay, it didn't happen this way in other countries, right? It may be partially responsible for the inflation that we're experiencing, although it should be less important now. Okay, and we'll talk about that also moving forward in the discussion if we still have enough time. But real disposable income, right, is no longer increasing and is flattened out. Okay, and this is not great. This is the spending power of the American consumer. It doesn't look good right now. Okay, and so there's a really good blog out there called Fed Guy, written by a guy named Joseph Wang, who is a former Fed trader, and he really has a handle on the data and things like that. This isn't really his monetary policy stuff, which is excellent. But here he is, this is his argument that, maybe we ought to be paying attention to these potential credit bubbles that are forming. Okay, these are cumulative commercial bank loans and leases year to date over the last 4 years. They skipped 2020. 2020 is an anomaly. Everything looks funky in 2020. So they skipped that and went with years that should be more normal looking. Okay, and you can see, right, commercial bank loans and leases year to date have increased in 2022 much more rapidly than in any of these previous years. Okay, that in and of itself doesn't say anything, right? But it's one factor that could be leading to a credit bubble, meaning we're going to get people so indebted they're not, and this is commercial. This is not just consumers now, but that people and firms could be getting so indebted that they can't pay their debt back. They're going to default. They're going to go bankrupt. There's nothing contributing to economic activity then. Okay, and so here's another look at it in terms of the actual bank loans and leases by type. And this one is truly, I don't know, let's just say interesting. It's a value judgment free. Notice that the top line in January 2022 through December 2022, more bank loans to commercial and industrial than any other. It's the second one down, commercial real estate, right? Does not make sense, right? Because the commercial real estate sector is the hardest hit sector of all from the pandemic, and they have not recovered, and it doesn't look like they're going to. We've changed our behaviors now. Work from home is a real phenomenon. In Austin, look around downtown. I'm not in town right now. I'm out of town. But you're in downtown Austin. If you look around, a lot of those buildings that are going up now, they've slowed construction. And the Facebook tower, the Meta tower is the one. Let's see, you're at the Hyatt Place, right? I don't know if you can, you might not be able to see it from where you are, but there's a giant tower under construction right in the middle of downtown Austin that has slowed considerably on the construction. And Meta has already said, we're not even moving in when it's done. They're gonna lease the space now. So we've overbuilt commercial real estate based on a world, pre-pandemic world, that has not reemerged following the pandemic. And so why we're financing commercial real estate to the level that we are doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's the type of not making sense borrowing that can lead to crises. Okay, and that's Joseph Wayne's point. Okay, it was interesting that he left off the green line, though. The green line is actually the growth of bank deposits. This is how banks typically fund themselves, right? Primarily from our deposits, and the deposits have started to fall as well. Okay, meaning they're going to have less funding available in which to make loans moving forward. Okay, so there's a lot of talk nowadays. That's interesting. I seem to be missing. I got font problems. Well, they're supposed to. Sorry, I'm just noticing typos on my slides, and it's actually not my fault. I don't know what's going on, but it won't let me type the quotation marks. That "don't fight the Fed" is a really famous phrase. Okay, meaning don't put your money in a place where you're assuming that the Fed is going to be is not going to work against you. Okay, and so there's been a lot of talk now, quite obviously, about the Fed, because the Fed is actively engaged in trying to slow down the economy. They're trying to engineer what they call the soft landing. Okay, with a hard landing recession is the worst type of recession. They're harder to recover from. More people get laid off. More firms go bankrupt. Soft landing is what you want, obviously, but nobody has any idea at this stage, if the recession even comes, how severe is it going to be? Okay, but the Fed has some special issues involved in all of this, and there's some interesting dynamics playing out with monetary policy right now. This is a brand new topic. I don't think we've discussed anything like this in previous meetings at all, but central banks covet credibility. Independence of a central bank from the political process generates the credibility, right, that they need in order to conduct monetary policy. If they make pronouncements and then they don't follow through on it, or if they say we're not going to be subject to political influence and then they are, okay, they lose that credibility. And when you lose credibility, right, then people in markets start acting in ways that indicate they don't believe what you're saying, and that works against your goals as a central bank. So they need that credibility. They need people believing them and believing that their policies are going to be effective in order for policy to be, they need people believing that for it to work. It needs to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, right now there are two separate issues that are out there related to Fed credibility. First one is an old classic, the Fed's ability to hit its inflation target in the medium term. The Fed sets a 2% inflation target. It tells us that it attempts to hit that goal on the medium term because the Fed can't, they can't decide the inflation rate. It doesn't work that way. They can conduct monetary policy in a way such as to attempt to hit that target inflation rate, and that's what they do. They tell us that their goal is to hit that in the medium term. They don't even tell us what the amount of time that is. Okay, so they're covering their bases, right? They're not telling us we're going to hit 2% every month. They're telling us if it's above 2%, we're going to work on bringing it down. And if it's below 2%, we're going to work on bringing it up. Okay, that's one credibility issue. The other one that's resulted in a game of chicken right now with financial markets is the Fed's ability to slow economic activity. So here's the expected inflation credibility issue in one slide. Okay, this is a graph showing the expected inflation rate over the next 5 years. It's called the break-even inflation rate. And it's the market's anticipation of what the inflation rate is going to be on average over the next 5 years. Doesn't tell you what inflation is going to be next year, and then the year after, the year after. It just says on average, okay, the inflation rate, according to market yields on treasuries and tips, the market is anticipating an expected inflation rate equal to this. So I'll pick a day, and it's going to, on the graph, and it's going to tell you on that day, the market was anticipating an average inflation rate of this percent over the next 5 years. Okay, so before the pandemic, Okay. The Fed was losing credibility. This one only goes back to 2018, but the Fed announced their 2% inflation target in 2012, and then they were below it every single quarter up until I think this quarter right here. And so, the Fed has a mandate to keep inflation low and stable, or keep low and stable. And they've decided the 2% target is how they're going to manifest that mandate. But then when they're below it for years at a time, they begin to lose credibility. People started to believe they don't really have a 2% inflation target. They're more concerned about inflation going up, and so they're going to keep the economy running slow, right, and keep the inflation rate low. And doesn't look like they care very much if it's below 2%, because it's below 2% month after month after month after month, and they're not doing anything to bring it back up. Okay, or at least they're not being effective at it. So they were losing credibility because of that. Okay, now, the expected inflation rate. So you can see expected inflation was below 2%. Okay, people didn't believe that the Fed was going to be able to hit their inflation target because they hadn't done it for years. Okay, now, right after the pandemic, inflation rates went way up, right? And so did the break-even inflation rate, or the expected inflation rate, also increased. But you can see it hasn't increased anywhere near as much as actual inflation has, and it's come down substantially over the last year. This is telling us participants in financial markets believe the Fed is credible and that they're going to be able to keep inflation low and stable. As of the most recent date on this graph, which would have been just a couple of days ago when I put it together, okay, the markets were anticipating over the next 5 years the inflation rate would average about 2.4%. Well, it's up around 6-point-something% right now. So that means that they're very confident that it's going to be much lower than that on the back end of those 5 years, or else the average over 5 years would not be coming down to 2.5, okay, or below 2.5. So the Fed is credible when it comes to fighting inflation, right? People, they may not be credible in bringing inflation up to target, but people believe they're going to be successful in bringing it down to target. That's shown in the data. Okay. The other issue about the credibility of the Fed has a name, right? And you may have heard this. It's something that's used on financial talk shows, CNBC. The Fed put. Okay, that's options terminology, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, we've heard over and over again the basic saying from Milton Friedman that monetary policy works with long and variable lags. So that when the Fed changes interest rates and changes the cost of borrowing, that doesn't impact a company's, say, investment spending right now. Okay, they've got plans for future projects, and it's going to affect that. So it may be months or years down the line before the monetary policy truly has an effect in slowing down spending. That is, partially true, but it's certainly not the full story. Okay, and when Fed changes interest rate, it affects financial markets immediately, and that affects people's spending decisions immediately. Okay, we talk about something called the wealth effect in economics. When household wealth, and it could be firms' net worth as well, but we'll stick to households, when household worth goes up, their consumption goes up too. It's not like they can spend that money. Their house got more valuable. You can't spend that, right? But your consumption will go up because you feel more secure about the future. I don't have to save as much. I'm wealthier than I used to be. So spending will increase. So when the stock market is going up and rapidly, it means that people are going to be spending more, and that makes the Fed's job difficulty in trying to slow the economy down. The problem is that this Fed put idea is something that the Fed has effectively done since the financial crisis, and some people argue even before. The fact of the matter is the Fed was stepping in and saving financial markets from crashing over and over and over again. That became known as the Fed put. And it's led to this mentality that we have amongst many players in financial markets, where they start believing that the market never goes down, that when it starts going down, the Fed is going to step in and rescue us. We're going to lower interest rates, which is going to increase valuation. Stock prices go up naturally from there. Okay, and that's what they're doing right now. Here's a graph showing you. I noticed when I was looking at this, the version that's posted on the conference program, this graph is all askew, right? But my version, my PowerPoint slides are fine. It's something about the rendering on the screen apparently. So yeah, this is quantitative easing one. This is the Fed expanding its balance sheet.
Michael.
Okay, which was quantitative easing.
Never mind. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is Larry. We're running until almost 6, and we need to stop pretty soon. So think about wrapping up as soon as you can.
Yeah. I'll stop right after this discussion because this is probably one of the more interesting things I've got to say, and I'll stop there. Okay, so here's the graph. This is the S&P 500, the red line. Okay, this is the size of the Fed's balance sheet, the assets from the balance sheet, right? And these are all the different monetary policy interventions. And the Fed has never done anything like this before the financial crisis in 2009. Okay, so this is all the new monetary policy, right? And you can see, right, every time the stock market looks like it's starting to go down, they get rescued by the Fed. That's what we mean by the Fed put. Okay, so right now, the market's playing a game of chicken with the Fed, right? The Fed is trying to deflate asset markets. They don't tell us that, but that's the only way they're really going to stop. They're going to slow the economy down. Every time asset values go up, people spend more money, and that makes the economy stay hot. So they're trying to slow down the rise of asset values, right? But every time we get some sort of economic news that looks like, okay, maybe the Fed's going to have to cut rates in the future, the market starts to rally again. And then the Fed sends out all their governors and everybody to give speeches saying, no, we're still going to continue to increase interest rates. Your people are not looking at the data correctly, et cetera, right? But every day, every other day, turn on the TV, market's back up again. Everybody thinks the Fed's going to have to cut rates in. And then the Fed comes out and says, no, we're not going to cut rates. So there's a huge credibility issue here. Markets are anticipating assistance from the Fed. The Fed is trying to tell us we're not going to step in and do it, but they've told us that before. Okay, so now we've got a huge credibility issue. It's not on the inflation front, it's on this Fed put front. So I will stop there. There was some stuff on inflation, but I'm sure you've all heard enough on that by now. So I understand you got to get going at 6 o'clock. I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you very much. If you want me to stay for questions, I'm happy to do it.
Please. We do have one online question for you that I'll let Curie read to you. Or
I've got some stuff in my chat window, but I didn't have. I mean, I can't obviously read that while I'm.
Oh, you can't. Okay. Okay. So Jim says, when there are questions, I would like to know Michael's opinion of how much the medical industry staffing crisis will impact the economy. I have 3 family members in the profession, a traveling contract nurse in med school, another in department, head of a rural hospital in Maine, and several friends, including hospital administrators, and they all talk about how much money hospitals are losing due to the labor staffing crisis among doctors and nurses. The numbers I hear are hospitals are losing from 5 to 10, 11 million per month, and rural hospitals where staffing issues are always an acute concern seem to be hit the hardest. It seems the medical industry on the verge of collapse. Is this accurate, and what economic impact will it likely have? And how much do you think Congress's desire to mess with extending the debt ceiling contribute to the risk of likely recession? It's actually 2 questions there.
Yeah, well, the debt ceiling one is easy. The debt ceiling one is easy. Okay.
You're okay. Go ahead.
Okay. I can now. I thought somebody else was talking. That's my own voice echoing back at me. Okay. The debt ceiling one is easy. If it actually follows through, if we actually follow through on this and wind up having to default on our debt, it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for the global economy. U.S. Treasury securities form the basis of the global economy. They are the primary safe asset used by people, firms, banks, financial institutions, governments all over the world. And if we default on our debt, that stuff is going to become basically worthless, right? And that is the collateral for almost every financial transaction that requires collateral in the global economy. It's the basis for the reserves of insurance companies and banks, et cetera. It's going to be a catastrophe. I think they're going to go up. It's going to be brinkmanship again. They're going to go right up to the edge again. And then I'm sure they're going to reach a resolution. What we need is a permanent solution to this ridiculous game that we have happen every few years, because it does nothing but disrupt the economy. And this isn't just about the U.S. economy anymore. Now, as far as the medical industry goes, I'm not sure I can give you a reliable answer. I mean, I could make something up, but a reliable answer to what the impact on the overall economy would be from that. That's a difficult question. But I will tell you that the healthcare sector is a huge part of our economy now, and a growing part. It's an incredibly important service that we rely on, and it's bigger in our economy than it is in any other country in the world. Okay, we have some obvious issues with what I would say industrial structure here. There's been a lot of consolidation, right? Some of it vertical, some of it horizontal, and it's led to a medical care service sector that's not really delivering on what it's supposed to be delivering on. Costs are incredibly high, right? And as you said, a lot of these places are suffering. I was not aware that the crisis was as pervasive as you described. I knew that rural healthcare centers were disappearing, right? I mean, we get stories about that in Texas all the time now. Rural clinics are a thing of the past, just like rural banks are a thing of the past. But this is the only. I wish I could come up with a solution to this, but we've made decisions that we're going to have a 100% market-based healthcare system. Okay, which isn't really true anyway, the way we structured it, but that's the rhetoric that we hear. And that involves a whole different set of problems and costs that you don't face in other countries. And so our outcomes are naturally worse and more costly than they are in most of the rest of the world. I don't think I'm answering your question, though, and I'm not sure I can give you a better answer to that. This is not a sector that I specialize in at all. I sympathize, obviously. This is, you've got family members that are being affected by all of this. I have a very good friend who's actually works as a contract nurse. He's a nurse practitioner.
Mike, we need
and he tells me all kinds of horror stories. Okay.
Thank you, man.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.